archived. And I want to thank the iNACOL Midwestern Committee for hosting this special webinar. Today, we will have an incredible presentation, an overview on an introduction to competency education. And I want to give kudos and credit to Sandra Dop from Iowa. She's the director of the Iowa Competency-Based Education Collaborative from the Iowa Department of Education. She's got a great blog in EdWeek on competency-based education. But I'll begin with an overview, and we'll take a look at Iowa as an actual example in practice, both from the state and from the districts implementing competency-based education in their schools. So just as we get started, to give an overview, in Sandra's blog, she talks about competency-based education being based on three premises. First, that all learning is deeply personal, therefore students may struggle or excel in different things at different times, but they might connect with content in different ways. Second, learning happens anytime and everywhere and should be validated even if it did not take place in, quote, school or a school building. Third, when we are truly transparent about what is expected of students, they have to change and take charge of their own learning pathways. Some people refer to this as student agency. That empowering students to have agency over what they learn, when they learn, and how they learn is critical. So let's get started. There are different words used in different parts of the country and different states to mean the same thing. So you might have heard competency-based education, proficiency-based education used in Maine or Oregon, the terms performance-based education in Alaska or some other states, or mastery-based. The concept is the same. We worked with the field in 2010 to pull together 100 of the leading innovators in competency-based education in a summit held jointly with iNACOL and CCSSO to develop this working definition so we would all be on the same page in our understanding. Competency-based education is more than just having flexible pacing. And I think in our field of online and blended learning, that often gets misunderstood. Flexible pacing can be part of competency-based education, but they are not the same. So competency-based education has 5 elements in the design. Number 1, and this is critical, students only advance upon demonstrating mastery. Number 2, the standards and competencies have explicit, measurable, and transferable learning objectives that empower students. When you ask students every day, they can tell you exactly what their learning goals are and how they're going to address them. Number 3, assessment is a meaningful and positive learning experience for students. When students are ready to be assessed because they have mastered the content, they show what they know, that demonstration in the first part of the definition. If they haven't mastered the skill and competencies, then they try again until they do have mastery. Number 4, students receive timely differentiated support based on their individual needs. There are no gaps. As soon as students are struggling with something, they get that differentiation and they get that student support so that they work towards mastery. And number 5, learning outcomes emphasize competencies that include application and creation of knowledge along with the development of important skills and dispositions. You might think of these as 21st century skills: problem solving, communication, creativity. But these learning outcomes that are explicit include these core skills that students will need to be successful in college and careers. So with that framing of the definition, let's take a quick look at policy across the U.S. In 2012, we built this map out that showed how competency-based education policy, that is, moving away from seat time, was advancing in different parts of the country. And by 2015, you see how this map has filled in. More than 40 states have adopted policies moving forward on creating flexibility and options for competency-based education from seat time. So Maine, New Hampshire, Colorado, Arizona have a proficiency-based diploma option. There are just approved by the U.S. Department of Education. New Hampshire has the first waiver of No Child Left Behind or ESEA that is truly a competency-based assessment program or performance-based assessments. The program is called PACE, and I encourage everyone to look at it because it truly is a remarkable model based on systems, plural, of assessments, plural, that more closely align with students' formative learning, but performance-based assessments and demonstrating what they know. I hope it changes the debate on how we're thinking about, quote, an assessment system in this country for policy. This is truly tied to student-centered learning and competency-based pathways. So you can see there are a number of other states, Kentucky, Wisconsin, that have created innovation zones, creating room from regulations that may be tied to seat time so that districts and schools can begin to innovate with next generation learning models. Many other states have credit flexibility programs, pilots, or study groups examining where seat time is proving to be a barrier. So what does competency-based education look like in practice? What does it look like when it's implemented well? Every student has their own student portfolio or personalized learning map made up of standards and competencies. Teachers have rubrics with student work examples, exemplars to understand what proficiency looks like at different levels. Our data systems, our student information systems look very different. They have clear indicators of levels of progress of each student on each academic standard, and they tend to be tied to an e-portfolio so that that evidence of student work is also accessible. Students know their learning targets. There's a lot of collaboration with each other. There are adults shifting roles in powerful ways. So educators are constantly grouping and regrouping students, and teachers become more specialized in certain areas. They are powerful teaching coaches and more like an orchestra conductor as each student is mastering the skills that they're working on. Classrooms may be inside of school, outside of school, include online learning opportunities, expanded learning opportunities like after-school programs, have internships, museums. So it really is truly learning can happen anytime or any place depending on the standard that a student's working on. Now, for those of you that have seen this chart that was created by Jason Zimba, I'm going to just talk about this briefly, which is if you think about this S-curve as the trajectory for learning algebra, then the idea behind competency-based learning is that there may be a whole set of skills and knowledge that you need to learn along that trajectory, and each of those little circles may be different applications or nodes or ways of learning. It may be a textbook. It may be practice opportunities. It may be real-world skills and knowledge. It may be peer-to-peer learning, maybe game-based learning online. It may be a blended environment. But that students, as they learn, can learn in different ways, and this learning is linked, truly creating a next-generation learning model. So one of the things that competency-based education does is it becomes highly personalized as students gradually take more ownership of their work and learning through co-designing these learning paths with educators, with their teachers. And this is a little bit different when people are referring to competency-based pathways in more traditional models of even online learning or blended learning. Ask, are there true multiple pathways for students to move through the work? Are students being asked through evidence or a work product to be able to demonstrate that work whether it's online or in person, and really think about the degree of personalization in content and how they learn and how they demonstrate it. So competency-based learning is fundamental to personalizing learning at scale, and it challenges almost all of our assumptions about the present education system. I'm going to share with you some pictures. These are taken with my cell phone as I've visited schools around the United States, and give you some ideas on what you see. These are from blended learning environments, from blended schools. This picture was taken in Denver Public Schools at Grant Beacon Middle School, and it's a competency-based blended environment. So because students are moving on when ready, students don't necessarily all work on the same learning goal at the same time. So the teacher has, you can only see 6 of these, so the teacher has 8 different English language arts learning goals up on the wall. There are, and you can see on the whiteboard below, student exemplars. They're pieces of student workup, but these students are all using technology to look and research and explore different texts, so that if the English language learning goal is, I can determine the meaning of words or phrases used in text, I can analyze how word choice changes meaning and tone, they are empowered to find the content that most interests them in the text and work with their teacher on how they're going to demonstrate that. And then when they demonstrate it, unless they hit proficiency or mastery, they keep trying to work on it. They may use different texts, and so they're constantly co-designing this learning experience with their teacher. Let's take another look. This is the same middle school, and these students are in a room working on different learning goals. They're every 10 minutes or so shifting around to different tables, being guided by the teacher. The students are working together. There's a lot of creating content going on by the students as they work through their learning goal. And they have what is like a learning goal ticket. If you go talk to any of these students, they'll tell you exactly what they're focused on learning. They'll tell you what they're doing in terms of what kind of content they like to use, and then they'll show you how they're planning on working and being assessed with the teacher. When the teacher has determined the students have mastery, there's an exit ticket and they move on to the next lesson. The other really interesting thing about this room is that on the other side, where you can't see, is there spaces for other teachers to come in on their break periods where they would be planning, but also witness how different teachers are using these flexible blended learning environments, so the teachers are learning from each other. This is a science classroom where students are doing competency-based blended learning, and again, they have, they're each working on different learning goals. Students are working with each other, and the teachers constantly going around. Again, you see these tables move together in groups, and the kids are grouping, regrouping. There's a lot of discussion happening. This is a model from Minnesota of another blended learning school where, again, students on the outside that you can't see are working in small groups on projects. The capstone projects may take place over an entire semester and include multiple standards and competencies in different projects all being pulled together. So no two of the schools that I've been in look exactly the same, which is really interesting to see the innovations in competency-based education really take hold as the designers. I say designers, it's the teachers that are being empowered to design and also the principals. So one of the other things about this middle school here in Colorado was that they started with having station rotation models for blended learning. and did that to have a structured, standardized environment to begin competency-based education, to begin using technology to drive that. As soon as the teachers got comfortable in that more fixed, standardized station rotation model, the teachers actually went to the principal and said, we're ready to redesign our classrooms. And the classrooms started looking more and more like flex models. So the first time I've seen a plan of a school transformation to competency-based blended, where they started with one structure very tightly until everybody got comfortable, and then the ownership, the design from the teachers once they got comfortable and knew, really knew how to use the technology to help support competency-based education, you saw a lot of changes happening. So this is Summit, and it is a blended, personalized, competency-based model. And you can see some of the learning objectives. You can see the really flexible learning environment that students are able to move and do their work at their own pace with a lot of freedom. What I love about Summit is in the competency-based environment, they say assessment is always open. So once you have your learning objective and you're a student and you feel like you've mastered it, you go and you find a teacher. There's actually a Genius Bar-like table. Those of you that have been in the Apple Store, there's a Genius Bar-like table where there are educators, teachers there. So line up here at the podium at the stand if you're ready to take your assessment, then you show what you know. So students are getting lots of feedback in blended learning from digital content, but they're also doing research, they're doing application of knowledge and skills, and they have to demonstrate that knowledge with some evidence in a true competency-based environment. So this was on the wall at another competency-based school, which is posting exemplars of student work at different levels of mastery. And so if you've studied any of Robert Marzano's standards-based grading, in a competency-based or mastery-based system, they're often using this 4-point scale of Marzano. 1, that you're a novice and just getting started to learn. Number 2, that you're an emerging learner but not quite proficient. 3 is when you're actually proficient and you're showing the core skills and competencies. And 4 is when you demonstrate mastery. And demonstrating mastery through application of knowledge and evidence. So these are examples of different pieces of student work at a 4-level mastery in different assignments. And so you're going to see a lot of examples, and there will also be lots of examples online. It's a little harder to take a picture of so many examples when they're online. So I captured this idea both on the wall, both visible, and also in the blended learning environment in these e-portfolios and these exemplars of student work. So hopefully this is giving you a sense of how online learning environments may or may not truly be competency-based. Again, just because you have flexible pacing doesn't necessarily mean students are being asked to demonstrate with evidence that knowledge. This is from USC, Hybrid High. This is a high school in downtown Los Angeles. One of the core concepts for competency-based learning is that you only advance based on demonstrated mastery. And what that means is you have to know where students are when they come in. So in 9th grade, when students enter, an entry assessment is given to students, and they are finding that when students are coming out of traditional seat time-based elementary and middle schools, which is the vast majority of our traditional school system, there's students coming into 9th grade at a 4th grade math level, even though these students have been getting A's, B's, C's along the way. Because even if they're getting a B or a C, they're missing 20% or 30% of the content knowledge. By the time these students are getting to 9th grade, they may have different levels of proficiency along the way from 1st grade to 8th grade math. In a proficiency-based model, success is the only option. Learning that material is the only option. And so at USC Hybrid High, these were really difficult conversations to have with families and with children around, we're looking at your level of proficiency and we need to fill these gaps and get you caught up so that you can have the skills that you need to graduate with a truly proficiency-based diploma. So they called it dipping your toe into the math stream. We're going to see where you are. Everybody in the class may be at a slightly different level, which was absolutely true on the proficiency maps on those student profiles. And what happens is that the adults in the system are forced to redesign the student support to help bring those students up to speed. And we're seeing examples of students having more than 2 years of growth in a single year, 1.7 years of growth, but filling and identifying those gaps. And once you start to identify the gaps in knowledge along their learning trajectory, students can be accelerated and even end up among the highest and most advanced students in the classroom. This is a very different competency-based learning model than we have in most of our traditional schools. This is really hard to do without good technologies and online learning and tools. This is really hard to do and manage the flexible pacing and keeping kids moving along and accelerating them when they're behind. And that is why competency-based education today, it's different. It's got a lot of promise. That blended learning is a huge driver for being able to support that engine of allowing competency-based pathways and multiple ways to learn and personalize. So if you think about every student on a destination to a high school diploma in our K-12 system, with the skills and knowledge they need to be successful either in college or careers, you think about there may be different ways for them to get from point A to point B. There may be different waypoints that they're interested in, and sometimes they may slow down and go slower, and sometimes they may accelerate and go faster to their destination. Sometimes when they're moving faster, they may want to pull over and go sightseeing or go deeper into their learning on a different subject. And so really like this idea of building systems that are more like a GPS for learning, where every student has their own personalized learning map and you have access to the interest points and different speeds along the way. Everybody struggles at some point, and once you get it, and once you fill those gaps, we know from the brain research that kids can go faster. So students, I love this. This is from Stephen Heppel in the UK. He does a school design called Not School, but students should advance on stage, not age. This is a phrase you hear all over Europe when you're traveling and visiting schools. Stage, not age. Age and time are for adult convenience, and there should be no limit on how fast or how far students can go. Now I'm going to shift here and in the transition tell you we have an initiative at iNACOL that is called Competency Works. It's on competencyworks.org. You can link to it from iNACOL. And we have published more than 10 reports over the last 4 years, from introductory materials on competency education to a number of reports on tough issues like redesigning information technology for competency-based learning, how you design student services and support called On the Learning Edge, and how you actually design competencies from standards. So a number of reports on policy and practice. Maya, I saw you come in the room. Did you want to make an announcement, or are you okay?
Sure, yeah, I just wanted to let you know that there's a couple questions, as well as we have Sandra who's joining via teleconference only, so just a quick couple reminders to folks who've joined on the phone as well when you're ready.
Great, good. Well, let me go ahead and answer a few questions. I'll also want to make sure we have plenty of time for Sandra. and have questions at the end. But Maya, can you read a couple of those questions that have come in the chat room? And I'm happy to respond.
We had a couple around, curious about the ratio of online assessments and portfolio-based assessments.
Great question. Yeah, it's interesting. So when I use that phrase, systems, plural of assessments, what we're seeing is, I'll give you an example, because it's probably easier to have a concrete example here. In Michigan, in some of the schools, students are using a blended learning environment that's competency-based. These students use online assessments in almost all of their standards and learning objectives. They use 3 different online assessments, and then as a follow-up, because sometimes the teachers feel like the content is aligned to the standards, but may not go as deep as they want to. And since students are picking from different content from that personalized choices, as a way of helping the students, those 3 different online assessments give the student some feedback on the data dashboard and give the teacher some feedback, but the teacher does a performance-based assessment with the student. And Maya, I think your mic's still, thanks. The teacher is doing like an oral assessment. Okay, tell me about what you learned and describe this, and then the teacher will ask a question for the student to apply that knowledge, maybe in a different setting, or respond to something in terms of current events to be able to describe it. So it's a combination of both the use of online assessments, which are incredibly useful for offering that real-time feedback, but there is this pressure testing, or they call them in Europe moderating assessments, to validate the data that you have online, where you actually ask the student to produce either a project or do a quick 5-minute oral exam. That's what you saw that assessment Always Open in Summit too. So great question. On the New Hampshire PACE project, I will, while Sandra's talking, go online and pull up the one-pager that they have that describes how their systems of assessments work with the portfolio of performance-based assessments, and then how they are doing intervals of the online Smarter Balance assessment, but with more flexibility in terms of validating the data on the ground. It's a fantastic model, and so I will take one more question and then turn it over to Sandra and go find some of these resource links to put up.
So Susan, there was a question about how do schools avoid de facto tracking with students who are advanced in all subjects ultimately separated from students who need more time in all subjects?
Yeah, that is a real concern around equity, and we're just published a paper called Maximizing Competency-Based Education and Blended Learning that discusses equity in every single section of it. So the short answer to your question is we have to be vigilant about protecting equity. But the design of competency-based systems itself actually helps in this regard compared to traditional classrooms where there might be tracking, because every single student is held to the same standard, to the same learning goal, and the same quality of the exemplar for work. You know, the question's asked is some students are moving faster and some students are moving slower. Doesn't that potentially create bigger gaps? That's a valid question and a good question. Students have, now I'm getting really into the weeds of implementation, but students have what they call teacher pacing, or you could say teachers have teacher pacing, but you have to keep within teacher pace so that the gaps can't get exacerbated and create, like, essentially tracking. So that's why the part of the definition around creating immediate supports, you can't let kids get horribly behind, or you would have those equity issues. So the whole system is really designed around student needs, not whether, okay, it's the next bell period, you either got that chapter or you didn't, or you got a D and you're moving on. So these kids have, I mean, the achievement gap in America is actually far bigger than we know because of the way a time-based system masks it. In a competency-based system, you have far more transparency on what students actually know and are able to do, and the system itself forces you to provide those supports. Pacing guides are critical in ensuring equity, and the last thing I will say on the question around equity is the really cool thing is that every student has the opportunity, when I talked about that Marzano standards-based grading, not just to exhibit a number 3 on proficiency, but to go deeper and to go into deeper applications of knowledge. And most of those, in a lot of schools, there are gifted and talented programs where students are doing that level 4 work all the time. This gives every single child the opportunity to do that level 4 work and go deeper. So you essentially offer across the curriculum same high standards of rigor, allow students to hit proficiency and demonstrate that mastery in powerful ways, essentially creating that leveling the playing field in a way that's not necessarily that transparent in a time-based system. So great question on equity, and I want to thank you, and we'll do questions at the end, but I want to introduce Sandra Dop, the director of the Iowa Competency-Based Collaborative. As an example of how this works, Sandra, we'll do your slides, and welcome and thanks for joining us today.
Thank you. I did hear a beep. Does that mean that you can hear me?
We can hear you. Coming in loud and clear. Thanks.
Oh, good. That's good to know since I had to call in by phone and wasn't able to get on but with the computer. So I like to start with the student excerpt from a student essay. This was actually Elizabeth's college entrance or scholarship application essay. In Muscatine, they began with competency-based education and started with a committee of people to investigate and included students on that committee. They were so serious about student voice and choice that they really wanted students to be in on the beginning. And Elizabeth, in her essay, explains that at first she was very skeptical, did not like the idea, didn't want change. She was a senior, couldn't things just be the way they'd always been. And you can see from this part of her essay where she says that it actually changed the way she thinks about her own learning and became really a positive environment for her, which was a change that happened just in 1 year of her high school education. So what's been going on in Iowa then on the next slide, it gives you a picture of kind of the progress we've made. It first became a state board priority when someone mentioned it and they brought Fred Bramante from New Hampshire to talk about what's happening and the new things that were going on for kids there. And we worked then coming up with what would our guidelines be, how would this work, and then began with a forum that first year where we had 300 people sign up within 2.5 hours. We filled our forum because there was that kind of interest. And we began to then ask the legislature. So on the next slide you'll see the policy things that we started working with. First of all, in the legislature, what are the things that needed to happen? We needed permission to use something besides the Carnegie unit. And that session of 2012, the legislative session, we had asked for many, many things from our department for some very progressive, innovative things to start happening. And the only one that got traction that year was using the Carnegie unit, or eliminating the Carnegie unit as the only way to earn credit. And what we did was just to add an or. Now, in New Hampshire and in Maine, they're really starting to, it's going to be mandated by 2017 and 2018, respectively. But in Iowa, it's an or for us. So we're really saying, how do we get some traction with this? How do we know how we can help people and districts move on? And it's kind of becoming a grassroots thing. But we also realized that we needed some other things changed. So if a state is looking at this, you're going to have to really go through, we call it Chapter 12, whatever your administrative rule is called. go through that with a fine-tooth comb and ask what are the kinds of things that might inhibit this, we found that it was the definition of unit, that it was centered around a Carnegie unit or amount of time, and that meant credit was associated that way at the high school level. We have had some other things, like you could only teach one course at the same time in the same room, and we've eliminated that. We had a code that you could earn credit before 9th grade, but it had to be only in the 4 core subject areas. So we were able to eliminate that too. And then, of course, our rule changes according to whatever your policy, how that happens in your state. But then the local districts also have to look at what policy, what are the definitions of unit in our policies? What are our graduation requirements? Are they centered on time, or are they centered on learning? And often they'll find that they're centered on time. So out of the legislation, though, when they said that we could have that or for the Carnegie unit to be, we actually placed in there that students earn credit by demonstrating proficiency on competencies associated with that credit. They asked us to investigate this, and we had a task force, and that task force then recommended this Iowa CBE collaborative. These 10 districts that are on the next slide are the 10 who made the cut with the application process. But then we decided very purposefully that these kinds of changes cannot happen without our colleges and universities and our area agencies. We call them area education agencies in Iowa. That we needed to have people alongside of us to figure out how would this become a systemic change. And for colleges and universities, what's going to happen when our kids come to you? What do our transcripts need to tell you? Because if they change along the way, we need to make sure we're still connecting and letting the universities know what they need to know. But we also wanted to have some people from educator prep, both those who prepare our future teachers and those who work with future administrators, to come on board. And we were very pleased to get about 20 people who were interested and have been willing to make that shift and begin to look at it. And then on the next slide, there's a kind of diagram of how we see our work as the collaborative process of these leadership teams, the districts, the LEAs, the AEAs, and higher ed coming together and beginning to then say, how would we set up some kind of a framework? And I'm kind of calling that the breadcrumbs. How will we leave breadcrumbs for others to follow along? And the reason I call it breadcrumbs is because, just as Susan was saying, it looks different for the way it's happening for different students in different schools. We feel like we have to kind of let go of a lot of things at the state level and at even the area agency level. And each one of these districts is, because of their personalities, because of who's there in their communities, the community connections that develop, that all means that every school is going to look different, even though they're all working with the same core content, they're working with this toward the same standards, they all are still going to look very different. The other goal that we have is for some demonstration sites here in Iowa. And we know that because they will all look different, we've begun to think of these demonstration sites would be, if you're really getting interested in community engagement and how to really set up mentorships and set up real, true, deep relationships between the school and the community, then this demonstration site would be a good place for you to go. If you're looking at project-based, then this other one might be a really good place to go. We're not expecting that our demonstration sites all have everything down. So ultimately, though, college and career-ready students. And then when we think about our framework, that next slide with all the pretty colors on it, that's a two-dimensional picture of the kinds of things that we hope will be in there. And we're beginning to work on the one on getting started and stakeholder engagement, so that we would have a place for districts to go, and it'll be on our state website, so anybody will be able to go there, to say, what are some of the common readings? How do we get to some of these connections like competency works? How do we look at some of the things that are happening in other states and other districts? How do we engage our stakeholders? What kind of policies do we need to look at? So that's the framework that we're trying to develop. And that, what looks like a link in the middle is not yet a live link, but we're getting closer all the time. We hope to have something by summer. We're looking at principles. That next slide will show you. We adapted our principles from iNACOL, from that first conference that where they came up with the principles. We did realize, though, that the second and the fifth one were both about competency. So recently we've been looking at if these students advance upon demonstrated proficiency, and they have their competencies, their assessments, we felt like we really wanted to put into here that it validates all learning regardless of when, where, or how students acquire or demonstrate learning. One of the things of traditional school is that we really expect them to do things in school. But if they've learned it in 4-H or a family business or wherever they've had that opportunity to learn and demonstrate, we feel like that should count too. So if they built the family website for the family business, then we don't expect them to have to take WebDesign 1, and we want to use their family website as the demonstration of that learning. So our next step then, on the next 2 slides actually, there's 10, we call them the characteristics of CBE Systems. And under each one of these, if you can go to our link there, or the website at the bottom where it says iowacompetencies.com, then you would be able to find these under the planning documents. We feel like the principles are, that's kind of the theory behind it, but we needed something a little more concrete. What does it look like if you've really done some quality engagement with your stakeholders? And we felt like that means there would be indicators under there to say that your community members can explain this change and why it's happening. Community members can explain what they are doing and how they are connected with the school. So those 2 slides will just give you that little bit of an idea. We have some things underneath each one of those that would take me way longer than the time we have this morning to go into. But on the next slide, we knew that definitions are important. Terminology is important, and we became very confused at the beginning. Were we talking about competency or proficiency? Did you become competent or did you become proficient? So in Iowa, we made a conscious decision that the competency is that enduring understanding, that statement that it tells us what it is that we're all trying to know and be able to do, and that proficiency is demonstrating the skill. So you would become proficient on a competency. And if anyone is considering moving to that, I would say make those distinctions right away so that you know what you're talking about. And even as you get engaged across the country, I know Oregon calls it proficiency learning, and most of the rest are calling it competency. Then the other term that is important to define, well actually proficiency, there is something important about that one before we move on, and that is that when you define it, you make sure that you're defining what you really mean students need to know and be able to do. And what we've defined it in Iowa is they have to demonstrate that they could move on. That doesn't mean they have to move on, but I have to demonstrate at Web Design 1 that I'm ready to move to Web Design 2, or that I'm ready to use this in other content areas. So if I'm finishing Algebra 1 level of content for algebra, then you need to know as a teacher I would be successful at the next level, or that I can use this in my science classes and other places where I might need to use it. And then personalized learning. Susan was talking about a lot of examples of this, and we really want to hone in and know what are the kids' strengths. One of the things teachers say after they get involved in this is, I know my students better than I ever have before. And it almost, to me, means let's redefine No Child Left Behind and just say every student reaches potential. And every student has education connected to what they are interested in and passionate about, so that it makes sense to them. We've had two big questions on the next slide. What happens when they transition to post-secondary? That's why we have our higher ed team at the table. For the most part, we know that higher ed is very interested in this. If you look through New England, they're even signing documents that say they will fully support and accept students from proficiency-based systems. Our higher ed team is looking at how will we transition students, and like I said, that teacher leader prep. And then the other question is, what about sports and activities? We've had a conversation already with the Iowa Athletic Association. In fact, they invited the conversation, having heard that this was happening. And one of the things that we know it boils down to in Iowa, and each state would have to find this out for themselves, is what's the definition of incomplete? Because a student can't play if they have an incomplete. So that basketball student starting second semester has to sit out if they're incomplete. But what does it mean to be not yet proficient? Because that student in any other system might be eligible to play. They might have earned a C, they might have been just shuffled on or whatever. Or maybe there's a student who is proficient and is working toward advanced and so doesn't have it marked on the grade card yet. One of the things that one of our districts is working with them on is defining insufficient work and the difference between that and not yet proficient. And insufficient work is the incomplete that means no, that you're not eligible to play. So the other thing that we needed then is, if you move on to the next slide, what is a competency? And we realized that a lot of states are using standards, parent standards, priority standards, and they're using those as their competencies. Well, in Iowa, we are taking a little bit different avenue. We know we're marking new ground and may be able to make this happen. We're a little bit we've started, so let's put it that way. And then our graduate, so we're looking at on that next slide, what are our graduate goals? What is it that you want your students to walk like, talk like, think like as they cross your stage? And we pretended then as a collaborative that we were a school district. And we would take off our hat and think globally. What do we want these kids to know and be able to do? What are the most important things? So that's the avenue that we took. Now others have taken, if you go to the next slide, starting with the standards and going to competencies. So we chose to do it the other way. I just wanted to make sure you knew that it's not the only way. So if you go to the next slide where it lists our universal constructs, these are usually when we have a conversation with people about what it is that they want students to know and be able to do, we come up with these universal constructs. So this is what we've struck as in Iowa as the way that we are going to start our competencies. This will give you an example on the next slide, the critical thinking, that as we developed them, began to realize that we pretty much had a what, a how, and a why. What are they going to do? In this case, they're going to create solutions to complex problems. How are they going to do it? They're going to use inquiry and investigations. And what's the point? Because they want to influence internal and or external conditions. And as we looked at that, we thought, this is something that can tie together kindergarten through 12th grade. We have goals and processes that will work in high school, but every kindergarten teacher could use this to say, well, how do I move students on toward being able to do this? Complex problem for a 6-year-old is way different from a 16-year-old, but it still does work. And then we know that on the next slide where it talks about gradual release, that wherever this starts, if you started in high school, if you started in middle school, wherever it starts is kind of a gradual release. We're going to have to bring students through, here's what we need to learn. We have to be very transparent about those competencies and standards. And here's what we need to learn. Here's how we're going to do it. And then here's what we need to learn. Here's 2 ways. Which way would you pick? Here's how we're going to do it. I have this way designed, but I have a thought. Would you like to help develop this other way? So that you eventually get to the point where then they actually understand how to develop their own learning paths along the way. And as we're doing that, we are looking at, the next slide will show you what we developed as our graduate goals. And then we're taking those graduate goals and working them into content areas. So just to take a little pause on the next slide for your just personal reflection. If you knew that your students were ready and able to do the things on that list, which you didn't really get a chance to read, but they can truly solve problems, and they can investigate, and they can generate ideas from unrelated things, which is the creativity part of it, and really negotiate in a team process. Think about how that would be so different for your kids as they're leaving your district. I think we're coming up on the time where I'm probably going to have to stop so that you can ask questions. But I just will show you this one more thing. We've started a scoring document for each one of these things. And all of these will eventually be on that website that's at the bottom of the screen, that iacomped.com, or I think at the end is my email, so if anybody's interested and has questions after today. But Susan, I think it's probably have about 9 minutes left. I better turn it back to you for if there are questions.
Sandra, this is so fascinating. I wish we could go on for another 30 minutes here. I think the work that you've done with the district.
Well, I could, and I guess. Yeah.
Go ahead. The district decisions. I mean, I just think it's so helpful. Been trying to.
Okay. With this one more slide here. So, are you hearing me now?
I am.
Okay.
Thanks.
Well, what we decided with this district decisions part here is that we're writing state model competencies. They are not mandated at all. So we know that then every district has to make that decision. Are they going to adopt these state models? Are they going to write their own? And if they do, are they going to start with the standards or the graduate goals like we did? Are they going to clump things by grade or by subject area? How are they going to write some overarching ones, or are they going to write some cross-curricular? Those are part of the reasons we knew we couldn't write them all, because each individual district might decide, okay, so we're going to put this history and this language arts class together and call it humanities. Well, they may want to write some completely different competencies that bring together those two courses. So, and then, if we do have the graduate goals, those universal constructs, are they going to do a capstone project, or will there be other ways that we're going to know along the way? And then, of course, there's going to have to be a lot of professional development and a lot of time for teachers to really dig in and talk to each other and figure these things out. Okay.
Great. Thank you so much, Sandra. That was absolutely incredible, and one of the most active chats I've seen. Somebody was just remarking, we would be able to continue this conversation. We've got, 70 people on the webinar. It will be archived. We do have a mailing list on competencyworks.org to get regular updates on developments in the field. Those of you doing the work, would love to invite you to blog on the Competency Works blog. It's really a place for practitioners to give their perspective on different areas of competency-based learning, both what works and what the tough issues are. We do policy updates. This is really a preview, which I wasn't planning to mention, but we're doing a website redesign at iNACOL, and coming soon in May, we'll have updated forums for better two-way communication on specific topics. We have some iNACOL forums now, but we're looking to advance those. And wish they were up right now. They will be up soon, in just a month. And so on the question on two-way communication, thank you. Sandra is providing her email address too. Any last questions? I was following along with some questions in the chat room, and I'll try to go through them really quickly. Jay asked about federal and state accountability in the end-of-year summative. I would just say that is the biggest policy barrier that we're seeing in districts and schools. iNACOL has published in its reports on new accountability models for competency-based education. We believe strongly in accountability, but not the way the systems are being designed now, which are completely grade-based, age-based, and time-based. They need to be changed to better align to student-centered learning. And New Hampshire PACE is the very best example. Thank goodness there's an example out there. Eric asked, a student creates a display of all the different moth species in our local area. How is that assessed? Well, Eric, the question I have that really needs to be addressed is what's the learning goal, right? You have to ask what's the learning goal, and that'll tell you whether the student is hitting that learning target when they're assessed or not. It's a little bit difficult to answer the question, and without that, what information is on the learning goal. So that would determine how that student is assessed. Josh asked, traditional grades replaced by competency levels. Are traditional grades replaced by competency levels? And the short answer is yes, but honestly, when people are getting started on competency ed, there are different entry points. So you actually can do competency-based models within traditional grades, and most places maintain that just because the rest of the system hasn't loosened away from subjects and grades. So that you can do competency-based models within traditional grades and subjects, but they really start to get interesting. Kettle Moraine School District in Wisconsin has their global school where they've broken apart the standards and competencies and offer interdisciplinary seminars and modules, and that is such cool learning that is going on with the students and the teachers as they build out those competency maps. So yes, they can be, and probably should be replaced by competency levels, but you don't have to. It's an evolution, and there are lots of different ways to get started. And last, Sue Verma asked, can students be in school beyond age 21? That really depends on the state policy. There are some states that allow students to continue to work on their high school diploma until they're 21 or 25. They may or may not be within a school building. They may be working in a job or doing an internship that can continue to build those competencies so that they actually, in the end, can get a high school diploma. But that's really focused on policy. So let's see. Any other questions here, Maya, for Sandra before we sign off?
I think you caught a couple through the chat and then addressed the big ones. Thank you.
Terrific. It's just Sandra, you're on the phone. There are so many kudos here for your incredible presentation. Thank you for a very informative session and your groundbreaking work. And I just double that with all of the demands on all of our time in the education system to watch the work and the leadership that Sandra is doing in Iowa and the incredible work of the teachers, the educators, the principals, the district leadership there. It's truly incredible to see the transformation moving forward, and we know it's possible. We know it's the right thing for kids, and I just thank you for your work, Sandra.
Thank you so much, Susan. It is exciting, and watching what's happening for teachers and students is what's really awesome, because when you hear the testimony of teachers who are mid-career saying, I go home and my wife says to me, what's going on at school? You are like re-energized. It's like you're 20 again. You're so excited about school. And they are, because they know they're beginning to really do for kids what kids need.
Thank you. That's a great note to end on. So last notice, we've got upcoming iNACOL webinars. Our leadership webinar on April 8th will be on a new report on performance-based funding and online learning. It's the first updated cost research study on online learning schools and online courses. And on April 16th, there is a teacher talk focused webinar on hybrid learning classroom rotation model, which I gave an example of earlier as a nice entry point to help build that capacity for blended learning. And ultimately, we hope there will be competency-based blended environments. So with that, thank you all. Have a wonderful holiday weekend, whether you're celebrating a happy Easter or a happy Passover. My best to all, and thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.